What if the most dangerous secret in the modern church was never hidden in plain sight, but sealed behind a wall everyone walked past for decades without ever noticing? At exactly 9:47 in the morning, on May 26, 2026, inside a quiet maintenance corridor of the Apostolic Palace, a routine renovation took an unexpected turn. A worker, experienced in restoring centuries-old structures across Rome, ran his hand across a section of wall that felt slightly wrong. It looked normal at first glance, blended into the surrounding stone and plaster, but something about it did not match. The texture was too smooth in one place, too recent beneath the dust and aging surface. It felt less like a wall and more like a repaired wound trying to disguise itself. He did not call his supervisor because the wall was cracked. He called because the sound behind it was wrong. When he tapped it once, the corridor answered back with a hollow echo. The renovation had been approved months earlier as a standard maintenance inspection for possible water damage in one of the older, rarely used wings of the palace. Nothing about it suggested importance. There were no cameras positioned outside, no special security presence, no announcement, no expectation of anything beyond routine repair. Scaffolding stood along the walls, dust sheets covered the floor, and workers moved through a passage that quietly connected administrative offices to formal staterooms that had been closed for maintenance. But within 40 minutes of that hollow sound, everything changed. The supervisor ordered drilling to stop immediately. Within moments, the Vatican's head of infrastructure was contacted. From there, the situation escalated quickly to the Pontifical Commission for Vatican City-State. A structural engineer was brought in, carrying measuring tools and lights, treating it like a sensitive structural issue rather than a simple repair job. No one raised their voice. The silence itself became heavier as attention narrowed onto a single point in the wall. And then, within 2 hours of that first tap, the plaster was carefully removed. What emerged was not pipework, not collapsed stone, and not an empty service shaft. It was something far more deliberate. Behind the false surface was an iron door, sealed from the outside and hidden beneath layers of plaster, applied with clear intention. Someone had not repaired a wall, they had constructed a cover. The corridor was immediately cleared. Security presence increased at both ends. Every non-essential worker was removed. The engineer documented everything first: the frame, the corrosion on the hinges, the seal lines in the plaster, and the way the door had been deliberately concealed so that it would blend perfectly into the architecture around it. What began as routine maintenance had now shifted into something closer to an evidence scene inside the heart of the Vatican. The door did not open that day. It resisted quietly, not violently, but with the stiffness of metal that had not moved in decades. Only on the following afternoon, after careful work around the frame and hinges, did it finally give way and swing inward. The air that came out was immediately noticeable: cold, dry, stale. It carried the feeling of something sealed away from time, rather than simply forgotten by it. Inside was a small chamber, roughly 4 by 5 meters, without windows, without wiring, and without any visible sign of modern use. It did not feel abandoned in the usual sense. It felt preserved, as if someone had intended for it to remain exactly as it was, untouched and waiting. Along 3 walls stood 12 wooden crates. Each one was sealed with rusted metal clasps. Each one carried faded, handwritten labels in Italian, and each one bore dates ranging from 1947 to 1978. In the upper corner of every crate was the same faint circular stamp. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but it changed everything for those who recognized it. It was not a warehouse mark or a contractor label. It was associated with the Secretariat of State, the kind of administrative marking used in mid-century Vatican documentation to classify sensitive internal material. The structural engineer did not touch anything further. He photographed everything first, then stepped back and made the call that moved the discovery out of construction work and into institutional history. From that moment, the chain of escalation became immediate. Cardinal Pietro Parolin was contacted. The Vatican Infrastructure Office was briefed. The Pontifical Commission was informed. And within a short time, the corridor was no longer just a construction site. It was a controlled zone. Then came the call that changed everything. Robert Francis Prevost was informed at 3:22 in the afternoon, 3 floors above the hidden corridor. While reviewing correspondence for an upcoming synod, he did not interrupt the call. He did not ask for repetition. He simply listened. When it ended, he placed his pen down, stood up, and told his assistant to cancel the rest of his schedule. He would see it himself. When he arrived at the corridor, the atmosphere had already shifted. Guards were positioned at both ends. The engineer stood near the exposed doorway holding notes and photographs. Cardinal Parolin was already present, hands clasped behind his back, watching the entrance without speaking. Nearby, Archbishop Georg Genswein stood slightly apart, observing the open iron frame with an expression that suggested uneasy recognition rather than surprise. Prevost stepped into the room without ceremony. He looked at the crates for a long moment, then crouched near one. His hand moved along the edge of a faded label, dated 1953. He studied the stamp above it carefully, then stood again. "No one has opened them?" he asked. "No, Holy Father," Parolin replied. "We waited." Prevost looked once more across the sealed crates. It was clear to him, as it was becoming clear to everyone present, that this room had not been forgotten by accident. It had been hidden with purpose, not destroyed, preserved. Then he gave the order. "Move them to the Apostolic Archive. Tonight. Under escort. No inventory until I am present." No one argued. The crates were carefully secured, documented again, and prepared for transfer through internal Vatican routes away from public corridors. By nightfall, all 12 had been moved into a restricted reading room inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality that felt far lighter than the weight of what had just entered the building. Outside, the world remained unaware. Inside, the Church had just opened a sealed chapter of its own history, and the first page was about to be turned. By the morning of May 27th, the atmosphere inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive had shifted from uncertainty into controlled anticipation. The 12 crates, now secured within the restricted reading room, no longer felt like forgotten storage. They felt like a sealed testimony waiting for interpretation. The room itself had been prepared with careful precision. Archival lighting replaced normal illumination. Humidity and temperature controls were adjusted to preservation standards, and every movement was documented before anything was touched. Robert Francis Prevost was already there when the first seal was due to be opened. He sat at a long table beneath the quiet glow of the archival lamps, with Cardinal Pietro Parolin positioned beside him, and 2 members of the Vatican legal office seated opposite. No one spoke unnecessarily. Even the air seemed measured, as if the room understood that whatever was about to emerge would not remain contained within it for long. Father Aurelio Ceni, the chief archivist, stood closest to the first crate. His presence was steady, almost ceremonial, the kind of composure shaped by years of handling fragile historical records. A preservation specialist had already completed the preliminary checks: humidity readings, structural integrity of the wood, clasp conditions, and photographic documentation of the exterior markings. Only when everything was confirmed did the moment of opening begin. The first metal clasp was released slowly. The sound was small, but in the silence, it carried weight. When the lid was lifted, there was no dramatic reveal, no immediate shock. Instead, there was stillness. Inside the crate were neatly arranged documents, bound and preserved in surprisingly stable condition, considering their age. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the structure of the files remained intact, suggesting careful handling before they were sealed away. Father Ceni removed the first folder and placed it on the table with deliberate care. The document inside was dated March 14, 1953. It was written in formal Italian, addressed to a high-ranking cardinal whose name was immediately recognized by those familiar with post-war Secretariat of State records. Prevost read silently, once, then again. Then he paused and read a third time before passing it without comment to Parolin. Parolin's expression remained controlled as he read, but something subtle changed in his breathing. The language of the letter was structured in a tone of legitimacy, framed as cooperation and reconstruction in the aftermath of war. It described financial transfers originating from a government ministry in Western Europe, directed toward Vatican-affiliated financial channels under the justification of humanitarian recovery efforts. At first glance, it appeared administrative, even charitable, but the final sections removed any ambiguity. In exchange for financial cooperation, influence was expected, not in public teaching or religious doctrine, but in political positioning. Specific elections in specific countries were referenced, tied directly to the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. The wording was careful, indirect, and diplomatic, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. It described a system in which moral authority and political leverage were treated as interchangeable tools within quiet agreements. No one at the table reacted outwardly, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was recognition. By the end of that morning, 23 documents from the same crate had been reviewed. Financial records appeared alongside coded correspondence, internal memoranda, and procedural instructions outlining how certain transactions should be recorded officially, while others were deliberately excluded from formal archives. The pattern was no longer isolated. It was beginning to form structure. One handwritten note, undated and unsigned, drew particular attention. Father Cheney hesitated before identifying the handwriting. When he did, it was clear even to those less familiar with historical records that the script belonged to a figure who had once held one of the highest administrative positions in the Church during that era. No one spoke immediately after that confirmation. Prevost remained seated for 6 hours without interruption. He did not display emotion in the way people might expect under such circumstances. There was no visible outrage, no rhetorical reaction, no shift into performance. Instead, there was containment, focus, continuity. He instructed Cheney to organize the material chronologically. He asked the legal advisors to begin a confidential internal assessment of authenticity and structure. He requested that every name, figure, and institution referenced be cross-verified before any interpretation was allowed to form conclusions. At one point, Parolin leaned slightly forward and suggested that the scope of what they were seeing might need careful contextual framing, particularly given the historical pressures of the Cold War period. Prevost stopped him without raising his voice. "I know the argument," he said simply, and returned his attention to the documents. The work continued. As the second and third crates were opened, the pattern deepened rather than broadened. It was not random documentation. It was organized continuity. Financial transfers, coded diplomatic messages, internal authorizations, and external communications appeared in structured sequence, suggesting coordination rather than chaos. Each document connected to another, forming a chain that pointed toward a system that had operated quietly, but deliberately, over decades. What disturbed the room was not only what was being revealed, but how it had been written. There was no panic in the language, no sense of urgency, no hesitation. The tone across most documents was administrative, procedural, almost clinical. Decisions were recorded with the calm certainty of individuals who believed their actions were justified by necessity rather than questioned by morality. They were not hiding in fear. They were working with conviction. As more crates were opened, the scale became clearer. The names appearing in the files were not marginal figures or isolated operatives. They were senior officials within the church hierarchy, individuals with authority, recognition, and access to institutional channels that extended beyond ordinary diplomatic oversight. Alongside them were references to foreign ministries, intelligence intermediaries, and unofficial communication routes designed specifically to avoid visibility. Father Cheney moved through the material with professional discipline, but even he paused twice during the morning. Each time, it was not because of shock in the dramatic sense, but because of recognition. He was reading names that had existed for decades in published histories, theological works, and institutional records presented to the public in entirely different contexts. The distance between public identity and internal record was no longer theoretical. It was physical, sitting on the table in front of them. By midday, the crates no longer appeared as storage. They appeared as preservation. A system had been maintained deliberately, with structure and intent, suggesting that whoever created it had not expected it to disappear, only to remain concealed until a future moment when it might be understood differently. The question that began forming silently in the room was no longer what these documents contained. It was why they had been preserved at all, and who had made sure they survived long enough to be found. By the afternoon of May 27th, the reading room no longer felt like a place of discovery. It felt like a place of confrontation with something that had been carefully preserved rather than accidentally forgotten. The crates, now partially opened, stood along the walls with their remaining seals still intact, as if waiting their turn to speak. The air carried a heavier stillness, not from fear, but from the growing awareness that every new folder added structure to something far larger than anyone had initially assumed. Prevost remained at the table without leaving. Hours had passed, yet his focus did not break. The documents in front of him were no longer treated as isolated records, but as parts of a continuous system. Each one reinforced the same pattern: coordinated financial activity, structured communication channels, and carefully managed reporting practices that separated internal actions from external narratives. As the fourth crate was opened, the pattern stopped being implied and became visible in full form. This was not scattered misconduct. It was organization. Financial transfers appeared alongside internal memoranda that outlined exactly how funds should be classified in official records, while maintaining a separate, undisclosed accounting path. Diplomatic correspondence referenced unofficial contacts with foreign entities, sometimes through intermediaries whose identities were deliberately obscured. The language remained consistent throughout, measured, calm, and procedural, as if every action had been normalized within its own internal logic. What unsettled the room most was not the existence of these systems, but their tone. There was no language of hesitation, no suggestion of moral conflict, no acknowledgement of deviation from principle. Instead, there was certainty, a belief that the actions documented were not exceptions, but necessary extensions of institutional responsibility under the conditions of the time. Parolin studied the material carefully, occasionally exchanging brief remarks with the legal advisors, but his focus was increasingly constrained by what the documents were implying. At one point, he spoke softly about historical context again, suggesting that Cold War pressures had forced institutions across the world into complex compromises. Prevost did not reject the idea outright this time. He simply responded with restraint. "Context explains behavior," he said, "but it does not rewrite responsibility." The sentence ended the discussion without turning it into conflict. As the day progressed, Father Aurelio Ceni began compiling a structured index of the material. His movements were precise, but the repetition of certain names forced brief pauses in his process. Some of those names belonged to individuals whose public legacy had been carefully preserved in official church histories, theological writings, and diplomatic records that framed them in entirely different terms. Here, however, they appeared in administrative correspondence connected to financial and political arrangements that extended across multiple countries and decades. The dissonance between public memory and internal record created a quiet tension in the room. No one commented on it directly, but everyone was aware of it. By late afternoon, the crates were no longer being opened at the same pace. Each one required more time, not because of difficulty in access, but because of the weight of interpretation that followed each reveal. The documents did not simply describe actions. They connected actions into sequences that suggested continuity of intent across years, even generations. A system was no longer a theory, it was visible. At one point, Dr. Marta Ferretti, one of the legal advisors, paused mid-review. She had been cross-referencing financial entries against known archival records when she noticed something that disrupted her methodical flow. Two separate documentation paths referenced the same financial movement from 1971. One record, taken from the hidden crates, described it as part of a politically mediated transfer connected to a broader arrangement. The other, stored in the official public archive, presented the same transfer as part of a legitimate charitable contribution program. The numbers matched perfectly. The explanations did not. She set her pen down slowly, as if unsure whether speaking would change what she had already confirmed. "This is not incomplete reporting," she said quietly. "This is duplication with altered narrative." The room did not respond immediately. Not because they disagreed, but because the implication required careful acceptance. If correct, it meant that parts of the public historical record were not simply missing context, but had been deliberately constructed to present a different version of the same financial reality. Prevost finally spoke. "Yes," he said, "that is what it means." Ferretti hesitated, then began to continue, suggesting that if this became public. Prevost interrupted gently but firmly before she could finish. "When this becomes public," he corrected, "not if." The distinction settled over the room with quiet finality. Later that afternoon, external pressure began to surface in subtle ways. Requests for private audiences were submitted through formal Vatican channels. 3 senior cardinals, each with established roles and long institutional histories, sought immediate meetings. The timing of their requests was too aligned to be coincidence, and the internal staff recognized it without needing to say so. Prevost reviewed the requests without visible reaction and approved them for a later date, May 30th, not sooner. He was not delaying the situation, he was controlling its pace. As evening approached, the archive's atmosphere shifted again. The initial shock of discovery had evolved into structured analysis. Legal advisors worked through authentication protocols. Father Cheney continued cataloging, now grouping documents not only by date and origin, but by functional category: financial, diplomatic, internal directive, and external coordination. The work was no longer about uncovering what had happened. It was about mapping how it had been sustained. Outside the reading room, the Vatican remained outwardly unchanged. Tourists moved through St. Peter's Square. Evening light settled over the dome. The daily rhythm of the city-state continued without interruption. Unaware that inside a secured archive beneath centuries of history, a parallel record was being assembled that contradicted parts of the official memory. That night, Prevost returned to his quarters later than usual. The documents remained with him mentally even after he left the archive. He reviewed Cheney's preliminary summaries in silence, noting the expanding scope: multiple countries, multiple decades, multiple overlapping institutional channels that extended far beyond what any single office could have controlled in isolation. At 11:14 p.m., his private phone rang. The caller was Cardinal Matteo Zuppi. The tone was formal at first, but it quickly became clear that this was not a routine check-in. Zuppi spoke carefully, choosing his words with deliberate restraint. "I have heard," he said. Prevost did not ask for clarification. He understood the weight behind the phrase. "From whom?" he asked. "It does not matter," Zuppi replied. "What matters is that I am not the only one." A silence followed. Not empty, but loaded. Zuppi continued, lowering his voice slightly. "There are people who are frightened, very frightened, and not everyone who is frightened will wait for clarity before they act." The message was no longer informational. It was directional. Prevost asked if this was a warning. Zuppi avoided the word. "It is awareness," he said. "What you do with it is yours." The call ended. The room returned to silence, but it no longer felt stable. Something had shifted beyond the archive walls. The discovery was no longer contained within documents. It had entered perception, interpretation, and reaction. Prevost sat for a long time without moving. Then he reached for the untouched food on his desk, ate slowly, and placed the inventory beside him, not as an obligation, but as grounding. He slept only 4 hours. Before dawn, his decision had already formed. By the morning of May 28th, the Vatican Apostolic Archive had become something closer to a command center than a reading room. The air carried a different weight now, shaped not by discovery alone, but by consequence. The documents were no longer being opened with curiosity. They were being handled with the awareness that every page could shift responsibility, history, and institutional stability at the same time. Prevost arrived before anyone else, shortly after 6. The corridors outside were still quiet, the city beyond the walls still unaware of how much had already changed. Inside the restricted reading room, he sat alone for several minutes, with a cup of coffee untouched beside him. In front of him lay a document from the 7th crate, separated the night before because of its implications. He had already read it once, but now he read it again, more slowly, as if confirming what he already understood. When Father Cheney and the legal advisors arrived later that morning, they immediately noticed the difference in tone. Nothing had been said yet, but something had settled. The atmosphere was no longer uncertain. It was decided. The document on the table was not a letter or financial record. It was an internal report dated 1961, classified at the highest level used within mid-century Vatican administration. Its structure was formal, almost restrained, but its contents revealed something far more complex than any single transaction or correspondence chain. It described the existence of an internal group operating within the Secretariat of State for at least 15 years, functioning beyond normal authorization channels. According to the report, senior officials had made financial, diplomatic, and political decisions without direct approval from the reigning pontiff, relying instead on informal authority networks and restricted communication lines. The justification was not secrecy for its own sake. It was protection. Protection of institutional stability, protection of influence during global political tension, and protection of perceived moral authority in a world defined by ideological conflict. But the report did not present this as defense. It recorded it as structure. More unsettling than the content was the origin of the document itself. It had not been written by an external investigator. It had been produced from within the same system it described, authored by someone who had participated in or closely observed the operations. The details suggested foresight, as if the document was not only a record of what had happened, but preparation for a future where it would need to be explained. When Cardinal Parolin arrived at 7:30, he read it twice without speaking. Then he placed it carefully on the table, as if distance could preserve balance. "This is extraordinary," he said at last. Prevost responded with a single word. "Yes," Parolin suggested, cautiously, that such material would require careful contextual framing. He did not deny its seriousness, but he emphasized the importance of historical conditions, especially the geopolitical pressures of the Cold War era, which had forced institutions across the world into morally complex decisions. Prevost did not dismiss the argument. He let it finish. Then he answered with measured clarity. "Context explains how decisions were made," he said. "It does not remove responsibility for them." There was no further debate after that. The room returned to work. As the morning progressed, additional crates were opened in sequence. Each one reinforced the same underlying architecture. What emerged was not isolated misconduct, but a sustained system. Financial pathways were mapped alongside diplomatic correspondence. Internal directives aligned with external messaging strategies. Informal communication networks appeared repeatedly, suggesting coordination that extended beyond standard institutional oversight. The tone across documents remained consistent. There was no sense of panic or concealment in the emotional sense. Instead, there was administrative certainty, a belief that these mechanisms were not deviations from principle, but necessary adaptations to political reality. That realization shifted the nature of the discovery. It was no longer about what had been done. It was about how normal it had been made to feel.